Hello everyone and good morning. My name's Paul Glavich. As Adam mentioned, I'm currently the CTO at Saasu.com. We do online accounting software, predominantly small to medium businesses, but we do have a few large ones as well. And you know, without being biased, I'd say we're Australia's leading online accounting software provider. Also an ASP NET MVP. I think I'm in my 11th year at the moment. Written a few books, a member of a few groups like the ASP Insiders and a few other things like that. And there's some details you can see on the side there for Twitter, you know, blog, email and whatnot. You'll also see a link on there, which is right here. So you can pretty much follow along with the demo there. That's hosted on Azure. So you don't really need to write too much down, you just need to remember that link or go to that, because there'll be all the same assets and the same links to assets at the end of the deck. So you'll be able to, you know, like I say, you won't have to write anything down. This is actually a talk that I did at TechEd last year, so I've changed absolutely zero, so you'll see references to TechEd and things like that on there, so just excuse that please. Okay, now I was speaking with Adam before. You guys are tasked with coming up with a certain solution around MVC and JavaScript, obviously. And Adam originally mentioned that you guys were looking at using KnockoutJS, which is a good framework. But I'm here to do Angular. We in Saasu we're actually using Angular more and more. We've introduced it in a few areas, and we're phasing out a lot of the old stuff and using Angular to do a lot of the new stuff. We also thought about using KnockoutJS, which again is a good framework, but we chose Angular because it has a lot more than just data binding, which KnockoutJS is pretty much concentrating on. And again, it's a good framework, so you wouldn't make a bad decision by going either or. But we chose Angular because it has so much, and I'll go through a lot of that today. And I hate calling in a multitude of different JavaScript libraries, because when it comes to versioning, and they may get new versions quite regularly, it's a lot harder to manage all these different dependencies. So at any rate, what we're going to talk about is first getting to know it, also how you can kind of use it in ASP NET and how jQuery plays with it. And at the end we'll talk about some tips and tricks and what I like and what I dislike about it. Yeah, and then we'll wrap up. Okay, so first up, what is it? It is created by some devs out of Google. It's all geared around single-page applications, or SPAs, very much around code reduction and code reusability, and that's something a bit more difficult to attain in JavaScript. It's not like a statically typed language, but it kind of enforces this convention, which allows you to kind of take a server-side structure and place it on the client side, and we'll see how that works. It's got quite a good community. It's one of the rapid rises in terms of JavaScript frameworks. It really is gaining popularity. There are other good ones too, like Durandal and Ember.js, and again KnockoutJS as well. But this is really gaining some popularity. First off, the structure. Now this is a bit abstract at the moment. It's not going to make too much sense until we sort of get in and see it.
What you're taking, Rita,
yep.
Can we just do a pause? We're not getting any sound out of that, out of the speaker. Oh no, I haven't connected that. So do you want sound to come out? I think so. Is that alright? Sorry, Paul, and also that everyone can take their breakfast out of the paper wrappers.
Minimise the rustling.
That will minimise the rustling. I don't think we pick up chewing on the soundtrack, but I think we're going to get that.
Testing, 1, 2, 3. That's it.
Can everyone to pull their breakfast out of the paper? Like remove the paper? Oh, okay. Here we go.
Okay, on with the show. So as I mentioned, we've got this structure of an Angular app here. We've got the view, which is your markup. And then within the markup, you'll have a module or an application that's defined, and that kind of is the Kickstarter for Angular. You must have one of those defined in your views. And from there on, you can declaratively put in controllers, which will talk as services, factories, these things called directives, set constants, filters, all these kinds of things. It has a high degree of separation and tries to componentize everything. And all these elements get injected via dependency injection, or its form of dependency injection. So it attempts to be very reusable, very testable, and also very declarative. So when you go into your views, which would be your markup, traditionally, like if you're using just jQuery, it's not really apparent what's hooked up to what. You know, you've kind of got to reverse engineer, know where your libraries are, see what elements are being referenced, see what the CSS selector that jQuery is using, and kind of really mix it around, whereas Angular attempts to be very declarative, so it's very clear in your markup exactly what's hooked up, and then it's easy to go back into JavaScript and sort of see what's going on. Some of the basics. As I mentioned, it's very declarative. Everything has a ng dash prefix in the markup, but it's quite flexible. You can have data dash ng dash something, or ng colon something. My preference, as you can see here, we've got data-ng app equals Angular demo, that's defining our application. I prefer the data-ng syntax because it allows HTML5 validation. It works a lot nicer with that. So in our markup, you typically define your app, which is just, can be off the body, doesn't have to be. And from then on, we'll interact with things like this scope, root scope. So what that is in our controllers, we have this little blob of data that is given to each controller, and that this scope is just this isolated object that the controller works with. Doesn't typically do any DOM manipulation, but the view works with that scope and other directives to get that the DOM manipulation happening. It's kind of a bit abstract at the moment, but I'll show you in the demo how that works. Service, factories, and directives, again, reusable components. Service and factories you can think about just as you do on the server side. And the data model is just plain old JSON objects, which is kind of a bit different to Knockout.js, which will use the concept of observables. With Angular, it's just pure JavaScript. Okay, so onto the demo. It's not very exciting, you'll have to forgive my UI wizardry, but what we've got here is a demonstration of one- and two-way binding. So if I'm typing in here, you can see where that's being reflected in those labels there. Nothing too spectacular. But if we go and have a look at the code, demo pages, basics. Okay, so in the markup, we've got our data ng controller. Oh, sorry. Excuse me, we've got our app defined first, data ng app. So that's kind of kickstarts Angular. Obviously, we've got to include AngularJS before anything's going to work. We've got our controller defined here. So what's that saying is, in this section here, it's going to be governed by this basic controller. And I'll show you that in a second. What we've got here as well is this double bracket, or sort of moustache syntax, and it's binding to a variable, what am I? So it's going to display the contents of the what am I variable in there. And we're using a slightly different syntax to do essentially exactly the same thing here as well. We're saying data ng bind what am I, so we're binding to the same variable, and this is one-way data binding. So we're getting the data from this what am I variable, and we're displaying it as part of the markup. And for our input, we've got data ng model equals what am I. So this ng model is doing the two-way data binding. It'll display what's in there, and also when you're typing in data, it puts it into that, that variable. So where is that variable? We'll have a look at our basic controller. That variable is actually on the scope. So here we've got, actually I'll take it first, I'll go back a little bit further. In order to bootstrap my Angular application, I'm saying window.app is angular.module Angular demo. And we saw in, here we've got Angular demo as the ng app. So that's where the hookup is. So that sort of kickstarts everything. So that app is what we reference throughout the rest of the application. Then we've got the basic controller. So we're saying window.app.controller. We're creating basic controller, and it's just a function. And it's taking in some scope. So Angular is going to inject this little object for us, this scope, and we're going to manipulate the scope. So we're going to say scope.whatami equals Angular one-way binding. And that's all we're doing. We've put what am I on the scope, and in the markup, we're displaying what's on the scope, and through that we're manipulating what's in the scope. Does that make sense so far? So that's pretty much the premise of Angular. You work with these isolated bits of scope that kind of aren't globally shared throughout the application, and you just manipulate the scope. You don't have to do any DOM manipulation. Angular takes care of that for you. So looking at this again, you can see we've got Angular one-way data binding. This is where the ng model is, and we've got Angular one-way happening up here. So that's pretty easy. Going further down, we're going to bind it to an object. So if I go back to demo here again, you can see we've got some data text. This is what the object actually looks like in code. And we're showing some text. We've got a date, time, we've got a currency, another number down there. And if I change that guy around, you can see the numbers changing. It's all pretty fantastic. Having a look at what we have to do to make that happen is, again, we're using this double curly brace syntax. We're saying I'm one-way binding to some data.amount. We've got some data.text. And we're also binding to, and I'll talk about these constructs in a second, we've got current date. We're binding to two labels to that. We're binding to amount, and also to amount here down on that object. Looking at basic controller, all we've filled up on the scope is this sum data object with text, current date, and amount. Nothing rocket science about it. But we can access that through just the dot syntax of that object. So we're just displaying the raw amount here, displaying the raw text there. With the current date, we're saying, all right, I'm going to apply a filter to it of the date type, and I'm going to display it in that format. Similarly, I'm going to apply the date filter to it. I'm going to get the time component of that and display it in that format. For the amount, I want you to display it as a currency, using that as a symbol prefix. And, excuse me, I'm also going to take an expression, so some dollar amount plus 10. So you can put expressions in there and say, also display that as a currency. I'm going to use those two angle brackets there as the prefix for that. And you can see here that that's exactly what's happening. So you've got some text, we've got the formatted date, formatted time, currency amount, and the result of the expression with that characters as a prefix. And if we keep going out, you can see that's nicely formatting for us, which is pretty cool. You don't have to do any formatting or anything like that. It's quite handy. Finally, so this is very much the basics, and for a lot of it, this is all you'll be doing. You'll just be manipulating elements on the scope, putting that into your view, good to go. Lists and filters. So I've got an input here, and I'm saying the model is this list filter object or variable. And I'm going to display an unordered list. And for that, I'm going to say, all right, ng repeat, and don't worry about this for now. I'm going to say for each item in list of stuff. If we look at our controller, on the scope, I've got list of stuff. And it's just an array of objects with a key and text members in there. Again, pretty simple. And I've got this list filter, which I was binding to, which has got nothing in there at the moment. So we can see here that that's just listed out those items for us. Now going, where was I here? So for each item in list of stuff. We've also got this filter element here, and what's that saying is filter on the text member of those objects using whatever is in list filter, which is bound to what's on the input element there. Okay, so for now there's nothing in there, so we're not filtering on anything. But if we go here and I start typing in, you can see it's starting to, apologies for the screen there, it's starting to wind it down. And we're back to that again. Okay, so pretty easy. Again, we're not really doing any DOM manipulation there, that's all being done by Angular. All we're asking it to do is filter based on what's being bound in the scope. And we've got some selected items here as well. Again, just showing you what we've selected in order to get that happening. I've got, I'm binding to list selection over here. And the ng model is list selection. This is on a select, mind you. And also, for the ng options for this select, what we're saying is, this gets a bit odd, for each item list of stuff like you saw before, but using the text, it's a bit odd. So item text is text for each item in list of stuff. Now that's saying for each item's text, we're using that kind of as the key value, but we want you to display the text. So I guess this is one of the better aspects of Angular, in that some of the syntax can be a little, I don't know, esoteric, I guess. So what's that saying here is, okay, so when you select that, so we're displaying text, but I also want to use, as part of the value of the binding, the text value. If I go back here and say key, refresh, I select that, you can see that it's actually using the key of that object to bind to it, but it's still displaying the text in there. So it's just allowing it to be a little bit more flexible as to what you bind to. It's not too prescriptive that way. Now this particular syntax is actually a fairly simple version of it. There are quite a few variations, about 5 or 6 variations on that do get quite hard to understand. There's documentation for it, but you know, it can be a bit odd. However, there are lots of examples for that. So there's just a few of the binding basics, and that's pretty much it with as far as Angular binding goes. There's obviously more to it than that, but you know, that's it. Scope, controller, bind to it in the view. Easy stuff. Now we come to this thing called directives. And these are important aspects of Angular. They exist in a certain part of Angular's life cycle where they can manipulate the document object model. So when you have to do any manipulation of any sort, you use a directive, because Angular applies that, again, as a certain part of the life cycle. Then at the end, when it does its what's called dirty checking to do all the binding, it's played nicely with Angular, so we can do its proper checking for the binding to take effect. If you do DOM manipulation within the controller, which you can, it may work. Quite often, it will just do weird things because Angular doesn't know that it's happened. It's outside of its prescriptive set of steps in the life cycle. So these directives, like I said, are these reusable components that typically manipulate the DOM. It comes with a few built-ins, ng-show, ng-click, ng-class, and I'll talk about those. They're fairly self-explanatory, but let's go into a demo just to have a look. So ng-show, actually I'll go into the markup itself. Built-in directives, where are we? So what I've got here is a div. I've got data ng-show equals show section. And on an input of type checkbox, the ng model is show section. So when we click on the checkbox, that'll set the value in show section, and this ng show directive will show it if it's true and not show it if it's false. So if I do this, there we go. I know, visually it's outstanding. You're all impressed, I can tell. But I haven't had to do any DOM manipulation to make that happen. There's my markup. If I have a look in built-in directives controller, where are we? There we go. Scope show section equals false, and that's all we've had to do for that. Okay, there's nothing else that's really required to get that to show or hide. Yep, it's pretty easy. ng-click, as you can imagine, is like capturing the click event, but it's the Angular version of that. And again, it plays nicely with Angular. So if we go have a look quickly, if I click on this div element, you can see it's increasing. I click on the button, those numbers are increasing. So what we've got here is on this div element, I've got ng-click, and you can see I'm using the different form of syntax there, not because I like it, just because I just wanted to show you, it does work with different versions of the syntax, whichever you're most familiar with. And when that captures a click, it's going to div click handler, which is denoted by the parentheses there as a function that's actually on the scope. Again, the button has data ng-click, and that's going to that function, button click handler, which is on the scope. And then we're just data binding to those two variables. Looking at that controller, where are we? We've got those two variables are initialized on the scope to be 0, And each one of those functions, as you can imagine, just increments that variable. So again, no DOM manipulation, didn't have to do anything spectacular, just told it what function to call when it's being clicked, and then modify the scope, let the binding take care of everything. Finally, not finally actually, ng class. So what we've got here, you can see we've got currently saying less than 50. If I take the number out, you can see it's put in a fairly silly error message, and it's colouring it red, which is actually the main point of this. Put that back in, you can see it changing. So what we're doing for that is we're saying, all right, data ng class, sorry, we've got on the input we're binding to number value, but data ng class, what this is saying is, all right, I want you to apply the numeric error class if that is true, and is number value invalid is just a value on the scope. And we're also binding data binding to the result of that function, feedback message. And feedback message is just this guy here. If we go in there and have a look at that. So initially, is number value invalid? It's false. Feedback message, all we're doing is we're trying to pass that number value that's also on the scope. You know, if it's not a number, then we set that flag to true, which will cause that numeric error class to be applied, and we return that message. And if it is valid, we still do a little bit further processing just to customize the message a bit more. But the main point of it is we're just setting a true or false value on the scope, and that causes that to be applied or not. And that's all it is. This sort of object syntax that you see here can actually be, you can apply multiple classes to it. You can actually have functions in there. It gets a little bit hard to work with. You're really better off putting it into a controller. Then it also becomes more testable too. But it is quite flexible as to what you can place in there. But it's basically conditionally applying a class. That's all. Again, you don't have to do any CSS selection to get that to happen. It just happens through the values on the scope. Finally, we've got this ng class even and ng class odd, which, as you can see, just applies a certain class based on whether the index of a row is even or odd or not, which you can see what's done there. And in order to get that to work, it's actually quite easy. So we've got data ng class even equals row even, ng class odd is row odd. So if the index is odd, it just applies that class. One of the things to watch though is that you can see that I've got that single apostrophe in there. If I did this, it would apply the value of, or would look for the value of row odd on the scope and try and put that as the class. So you can set that in your controller. But by doing this, if it lets me, I'm saying literally apply row odd, not the value of row odd variable on the scope. Does that make sense? So it's just very easy to miss. However, the directives themselves, very easy to apply. Just have those class names in your CSS, and it just whacks them in there for you. You guys with me so far? Okay. So they were just some of the basic directives. So we've talked about the scope, and that's where you manipulate all your data. And these directives that work with DOM manipulation, based off values in the scope. But more importantly, again, these directives are what you use for DOM manipulation. Don't do it in a controller. Again, you can, but it's not very safe. You can create your own directives. Angular has quite a few of them to work with. Services and factories. There's lots of technical terms you can apply to this, but if you think of services and factories in the same way that you do on server side, so they typically go and get some data. They don't have to. They can just perform a function which returns some data, in this case, to your controller. So in MVC, you'll have your controller. You might have a repository or a service dependency injected into the controller, and that'll call down, might call off to web service or whatever the case may be. Same thing with services and factories in Angular. Same concept. They get injected into the controller, and you can use them to perform a particular function. The most canonical example is just making a HTTP request. But also the intention is to separate, so you don't have these big massive controllers, same way as you would structure your MVC application. You don't have all your logic in your controllers. You have a very sort of lean controller, and you'll put different pieces of work in places, in the logical places that make sense to them. In some cases, you know, services, factories, whatever. It also allows for this separation of concern and easy testability in the JavaScript world, which, you know, traditionally can be quite hard to achieve, or is easy to spiral out of control and make it hard to achieve. But we'll see how that's done. So you can see a sort of abstract representation here. I've got a view which interacts with the scope. The main controller manipulates the scope, but the main controller also calls off to the service and the factory to get its data. And we'll just quickly have a look at the code first. Good services. Where are we? Service factories. There we are. So the actual markup isn't very spectacular. You know, I've got our NG app, our main controller, and we're binding to factory property value, factory service property value. And we're doing pretty much the same down here as well. The only difference is, on this section, we're using another controller, and on this section, we're using main controller. So we're actually using two controllers now. Now, if we go into service and factories, so in terms of what we're doing here, so the main controller, we're actually injecting the scope. We're also injecting the factory and the service. And we call on perform service on each one of those to do something. This is when we're going to click on a button. It's in the markup, we bind to that. And so factory property value and service property value just returns values from those objects. Remember, those objects have been injected for us, and I'll have a look at those objects at the moment. But that's all this controller does. If I have a look at another controller, it does exactly the same thing. I just called it something different just to show you, how you can use multiple controllers and how kind of services and factories work behind the scenes. Now, to look at the factories and services, all we're doing is off our module, which is window.up. We're creating a factory called the factory. We're going to return an object which has a property and a perform service method. And all that does is increment the value of that property. That's all that's doing. The service, it's called the service, and it's setting this service property equals 1, and when you call that function, it just increments that. So while it's kind of a silly example, we are taking sections of the logic, and think, you know, again, a canonical example is a HTTP request or maybe some complex calculations, putting that into a service or a factory. And I use these terms interchangeably. They are subtly different, but not different enough to warrant any major concern either or. The only difference here with a factory is we're actually returning an object. But before we do that, we can do some initialization work, we can do some extra logic, and then return that object. With a service, you can see we're just operating on this. So effectively, it's a JavaScript constructor function. We're not returning an object, we're just returning, we're filling up this, the context of this, and putting a property and a function on it. Whereas with the factory, we're actually returning an object, and we can do a bit more. Conceptually, practically, that's pretty much about it. So you could use service or factory, and you wouldn't go wrong. But the factory kind of provides a bit more flexibility, and I tend to favour that one. They are, however, both singletons. And so when we go here and I say, this one's off the main controller, you can see I'm calling a service and both these values are incrementing here. Same when I call factory, both those values are incrementing there. Just to put that in the context again, if we go back to the markup, which is, where'd you go, markup? Service factories. So one's operating off main controller, and we're binding to the properties that the scope has for that controller, and one is using another controller and binding to the properties from that scope. Looking at those two controllers again, they're getting the scope and those items injected, so that's another controller, and main controller is also getting those items injected. So they're not sharing the scope, they are sharing these two here. Okay, so those services are singletons, they're being injected into the controller's calling the function, populating its scope, which is being reflected in the view. You guys with me? All right, so we're starting to get a bit further down the chain. But it's like, again, like a regular application. It might start off very simple. You might have a controller with a few lines of code, fills up the scope, modifies the view. Then you start to get a bit more complex, making all these web service calls. So you start to separate it into services and factories. Maybe you're going to do some really sexy DOM manipulation, so you have to create your own custom directives. So you start to break things out. And suddenly what appears sort of unnecessary with all this separation actually becomes a really useful tool, because all the complexity can be put into these much smaller JavaScript modules which you can just inject at will. It becomes very testable and very maintainable. Okay. So a few built-in services. I talked about the canonical example being HTTP requests. So we'll look at that one. So we've got get data from server. Again, fantastic UI. And we've got that from the server, and we're going to post some data. Post data to the server. Bang, there we go. I'd actually just to prove that it's not just, you know, smoke and mirrors. You can see the example API that I just made there. If I do a get, you can see example API call that it's made just there. That's those two guys there. So looking at how we did that. Built-in services. So with the markup, again, not too spectacular. We're just utilizing services controller. On click, we're executing get data function on the scope, and on the click of the button, we execute a post data function on the scope, and we're just binding to some of the results. What I am doing for that little spinny GIF that you saw is using the ng show directive. So I'm just binding to that show progress, show get progress indicator, and show post progress indicator, and that'll conditionally display this GIF for us. So in the controller, services controller, when I go to execute a HTTP call, I can just set that value to true, and that'll automatically cause the view to be updated and display that little spinny GIF for you. So you don't have to do anything spectacular apart from just setting a true or false value on the scope, and that's all taken care of for you. So with the controller, you can see I'm injecting the scope as I normally do, and also this data factory, which we'll go and have a look at in a second, which actually does the HTTP call. Actually, no, sorry, we'll have a look at that first. We'll work from the bottom up. So I'm creating a factory called data factory. I'm injecting the $HTTP service, which is what Angular provides for you. And with that, I'm saying, all right, I'm returning an object. It's got a get data function, and I'm going to create a $HTTP promise. It's going to use, I'll talk about promise in a second. It's going to use the get method. It's going to go to that URL, and I don't want you to cache any results. Similarly, for the post data, I'm accepting a payload. I'm going to create a HTTP object that has a post. It's going to use the post method. Go into that URI, and you can see I've got blob equals that or data payload. You can sort of specify either which way you want there with the passing the data through. So what that's going to do is return a promise based off the HTTP object, again, which Angular provides. So it's not going to execute that necessarily immediately. But what a promise is kind of saying, all right, this is what I'm going to do, and I'm guaranteed that it's going to execute. And when it executes, I'm then going to execute the next function that you provide to me. And in practice, what that means is for our data factory, we're executing the get data function, which is going to return a promise. And we're going to say, once you've done that, then I want you to run this function. So you can kind of, with promises, you know, it kind of goes then, that kind of syntax. It's a way of getting outside the world of callbacks. If you've ever had to do a callback, and within that callback you have to execute another callback, within that callback you have to execute another callback, it gets very nested and very hard. Promises are a much nicer way of working with that. So for our data factory that got injected, we're executing the get data function, which returns a promise. We're saying then, once you've done that, using put the result.data on the scope as the get data result, and the show progress indicator is false. Okay, same with the post data. We're saying, all right, show the progress indicator. Actually execute the post data with the data to post. But this time we're saying instead of doing then, we can do shorthand for checking the status of the result to see that it worked or didn't. So we're saying .success and .error. So obviously if it's a success, HTTP 200, we're going to get the data and put on the post data result on the scope and set the progress indicator to false. If there's an error, we'll have an error message there, and just to demonstrate that it actually does what it's supposed to, I'll make a wrong URL, refresh that, try and post, oops, it failed. Okay, so that's executing this error condition here. So this success and error is just a shorthand way of going then and investigating the result.status and saying, if HTTP status 200, then do this, then do that. So it's just a nicer way of doing that. Okay, you guys okay with that? Yep. Alrighty. There's a few other built-in services. In fact, there's quite a few. Things like location, window, timeout. These are all Angular's version of exactly the same thing in the DOM. So, in a browser, you'll have window dot something. It's just a $Windows Angular version exactly of that. However, it becomes injectable into your controllers. So you can mock out $window. You can't really mock out the window object in a browser. So it's just a way of making it testable, but providing exactly the same functionality. That's where this location, window, timeout all come in. There are a bunch of other services as well, but that's getting into more advanced scenarios, especially with compile. But they're all well documented, and in your, I guess, initial use of it, you probably won't need to use them at all. Okay, routing. Now we're starting to get a bit more advanced, but we're starting to see some of the things that Angular offers, I guess, say, over something like Knockout.js. I guess the best way to look at it is just URL routing. It offers this concept of partial views, so based on a route defined in the URL, it'll load a partial view from the server and display that for you with full binding support and everything like that. But one of the important parts of it is it offers support for the back buttons or history functionality in a browser without you having to do anything extra. So typically you might have to get a library like History.js and programmatically add that to your application and code specially around that. With this, you don't have to do too much apart from configure it. So looking at the demo, if I go to view 1, actually, if you just keep an eye down the bottom, I know the font's probably quite small down here, but if I go to view 1, okay, it displays that view, and we can see down here that it actually went to the server, demo pages routing, and loaded this partial view 1.tpl.html. Okay, and you can see it's displayed there. Nothing too exciting yet. If we go to routing, you can see here I've got partial view 1, excuse me, which is pretty simple markup. We've got some data binding happening there. Got some data binding happening there. We've bound the model of this input to data.text, and we've got some more data binding there. So pretty simple partial views. And it's pretty much the same with each of those partial ones. There's nothing different. There's a bit of data binding, but nothing spectacular. That's not the point of this exercise, though. So now if I click on view 2, you can see it loaded the view down there. If I click back on view 1, it just displays that again, but we've only got 2 requests. So it doesn't reload that from the server, it holds onto that in memory. And if I click on view 2 again, no extra request. And you'll see up here in the URL, this thing changing as we're clicking on it. So I click on view 3, you can see now it did make a request to the server, and we've got view 3 loaded up there. I think, oh, okay, that's not too bad. But now what I can do, if I close that down now, if I go back, you can see it's got full history support as well. So I can go backwards, forwards, everything's pretty cool. It's not making any extra requests to the server, it's just retaining the state for us. So if I change that, and let's say I go back, ooh, that's changed as well. It's still got history support, but it is putting in the latest values from the scope that we've updated. So to get all that to happen, let's have a look at, where are we routing? We're loading the values of some controllers here, or we're loading in some controllers in Angular, obviously. And all we've got is our app defined. And we've got some hrefs, so view1, view2, view3. The href here has got hash view/1, hash view/2, hash view/3. Nothing too bad there. We've also got a div down here which has data ng view. This directive will say whenever you get a partial template, whack it into there. Put the view into that div section there. Okay, so that's the markup. That's all we've got for you. Notice there's no controller defined as well. If we go to our routing config, we're saying, all right, for the configuration, I want you to inject route provider, and kind of ignore this syntax for now because I'll talk about that a bit later on. I want you to inject route provider for us, and using route provider, when you've just got /view, I want you to use this template from the server, and I want you to use this controller, partial view controller. Similarly, for all these other view patterns, view1, view2, view3, use these templates, partial view1, partial view2, partial view3, and load up partial view controller. So it's instantiating the controller for us, loading up a view from the server, and kicking everything into gear. Okay, so with that configuration, and those partial views, and with that markup, which is fairly simple markup, you've got all that data binding in place, and you've also got full history support. Haven't had to do anything spectacular to make it happen, it's just there. Excuse me. For the partial view controller, it's pretty small. You know, I'm just setting certain data on the scope. Now you notice here, I'm also injecting root scope. So I mentioned that scope is isolated to each controller, and that's certainly true. But it is, it can be hierarchical. So if you've got a controller in markup, and within that markup you've got another controller defined within it, the scope that the controller within that's kind of nested controller gets will inherit from the original one, but have its own isolated version of that data as well. And so it can modify and add stuff to it, which the parent scope won't see, but it'll certainly have access to the original values, if that makes sense. So it becomes hierarchical in nature. However, this root scope is like the mother of all scopes. So whatever you put on the root scope is available to all scopes for every controller in your application. So if you change the value, or you put, and it's good for things like reference data or things that is just common to every single controller, put it on the root scope, and every scope that's injected into a controller gets what's on the root scope as well. Okay, so it's a good way of sharing common stuff. And in this case, this text something that you originally saw, if I go here, that's what I'm putting on the root scope, so that it's getting shared across all instances of the of controllers that are created when the partial views are loaded. Does that make sense so far? So at the end of the day, all we've done, just to recap, is we've got some markup with some hrefs with a particular URL scheme, and we've got our div that's saying, all right, this is where I want you to place any partials. Just whack it in there for us. And we configure it up to say, all right, when these URL schemes are matched, load up that template and load up that controller. That's it. It's a good way of kind of separating. If you think about your partial views and MVC, kind of similar concept. Only a partial view will be rendered on the server and all be included as one big blob. These guys are dynamically loaded off the server. But once they're loaded, they're not reloaded, and it has full history support within the browser, and full data binding and everything that you normally get with Angular. Make sense? So it's really good for history support because it reduces complexity significantly. If anybody's ever had to do that using other libraries, it really is a pain. Okay. Okay, directives. So I talked about these briefly before. Again, reusable components that Angular will provide a lot of their own, like ng show and whatever. But you can create your own and typically manipulate the DOM. Again, they exist in a certain aspect of the life cycle of Angular, such that it allows DOM manipulation. It says, all right, now all the DOM manipulation has taken place now. All the directives have been executed. I can now go and examine the DOM for changes and apply any binding semantics that I need to do. I'll talk about this once we've had a look at the demo. So, what I've got here, if we go to the markup, actually no, down here. So, I've got my NG app, and now on this button, I've got data-simple clicker. Okay, this is a custom directive that I've written, and all I've got is a button with that directive on it. I've also got an element here which says simple clicker with some content on the inside of it. And I've also got a div with a class equals simple clicker. Okay, so what I'm doing here, if I just show you what it does, which is nothing spectacular, it just says clicked, there's a div element that's clicked, there's another div element that says clicked. But I've got this reusable directive which I'm applying to all these arbitrary elements. In this case it's a button. In this case I'm creating a piece of new HTML which didn't exist before. And in this case, I'm just applying it as a class, using the same directive code, all doing the same functionality, but again, using that whole declarative mindset of Angular to say, all right, well, it's pretty obvious that I'm applying simple clicker to it, to this button. Similarly, especially here, it's very explicit, saying, well, I'm creating a simple clicker element. Whatever simple clicker does, in this case, doesn't do anything spectacular. For the simple clicker directive, and there it is. I'm saying on my module or my app, create a directive called simple clicker. I'll talk about that in a second. It returns a function, okay, and all it's doing is binding to the click event and saying, okay, show an alert clicked. Now this element bind is kind of Angular provides a light version of jQuery within it, so it has very jQuery-like semantics and syntax that you can use to search for elements. However, if you load jQuery into your application, it will actually use jQuery, so you can have the best of both worlds. If you don't want to include jQuery, you don't have to, and you can just stick to Angular's version, which is a very cut-down version of jQuery, but it does work quite well. However, you can include jQuery, and that's all fine too, and you'll get the enhanced functionality that comes with that. So in this case, I'm just binding to the element that the directive is on, onto the click event, and just doing an alert clicked. Nothing too spectacular. What this is saying up here, this restrict option, is saying I want you to restrict it to attributes, elements, and classes. So that's the only place that you can use this directive on, this simple clicker. Sorry, if I go back to the markup. So I've used it here as an attribute, a data attribute. It's actually an element, and in here I'm using it as a class. If I go to this directive and say, I don't want you to support custom elements, I think that's sort of breaking HTML. I don't like it. So let me just reload that. So now, if we go back to the markup, this was the element, it was the second one there. So the first one, the data attribute still works. I click on that. I guess you just have to see if you can hear my click. I'm actually clicking. And on the class one, that still works fine. So in my directive, I'm saying, look, I'm only supporting attributes and class syntax. I'm not supporting this custom HTML. If I go back here, put the E back in so I can support elements. Reload the page. Okay, that one still works, that one still works, that one still works. So you can see here that it's actually quite expressive. So we can imagine a directive being far more complex, it does some really creative things on the page. It doesn't have to look too complex on the page, but it can say, all right, again, very declaratively, applying simple clicker to this. I'm using the simple clicker directive there, and that's extremely explicit because it's a piece of HTML. Or I'm using the class way of doing it there. Now you'll also notice that I've named it simple clicker and kind of camel case. Angular will expand that out and look for that, as you can see in the markup. Okay, as we've got there, and similarly on the data attribute there. So it's a nice reusable way of encapsulating some JavaScript logic, particularly DOM manipulation, and just applying that to any number of elements that you like. Seems simple enough so far? For directives, that's essentially what a directive is. However, it's this part here that can kind of, again, get quite complex. In this case, it's quite simple. I've got a restrict option and a link function, which just does very simple stuff. It passes in a scope, passes in the element and the attributes of that element that we can also query in there. Now, something a bit more complex is in order. Going down here, we have this big div here, and we're creating a widget. And we're saying data circle, and it's clickable. So we're using the element syntax here. We're also using the attribute syntax down here. We're saying, all right, we're applying this widget directive, and we're giving it a circle attribute and a clickable attribute. And oddly, I don't particularly like this syntax, but you can invoke a directive as a comment. So you can see I've got directive colon, a widget, and it's a disk. Looking at what's output here, these are these three items here. So the first two were clickable. Both circles. The last one was a disk, and it's not clickable. That's done by the comment. So I click on those two, that's all good. Can't click on this last guy here. Now looking at that directive, again this one's a bit more complex just because it does some DOM manipulation, you know, it captures clicks and then gets the element to move, that kind of thing. But essentially we've got telling this directive, which is a widget directive, to restrict to attributes, elements, and M being comments. So this is where some of the syntax gets a bit odd. We've got a template, and I want this directive to replace whatever I've got in the markup with this template. And then what I'm doing here, you don't have to worry too much about the logic, but I'm sort of inspecting the attributes of the element that it's attached to. I'm changing its CSS position to relative. If the square is defined, I'm going to set some CSS so that it looks like a square. Else, if circle or disk is defined, I'm going to create a canvas and do some SVG magic that will draw a disk or draw a circle. Okay, and if it's clickable, I'm going to bind to the click event, and then I'm using jQuery to do some animation. Okay, so all that property inspection and CSS manipulation and click handling and animation is all encapsulated within this nice little directive here. So when it comes to actually expressing it in the markup, again via a custom element, data, or a comment. So I can probably say let's square, refresh, well, maybe not. Ah, if I spell it right, perhaps I could do that. There we go. And that's also clickable. Okay, so you know, it looks pretty simple. It also looks fairly, you know, it's quite readable as to what's happening here. I'm creating a widget. It's a circle and it's clickable. I'm creating another circle in that second div, which is also clickable, or I can create a disk, which is clickable. That one's clickable. That one's not. So, again, a bit more advanced version of directives, and they get quite substantially more advanced than that. There's a lot you can do with them. There's a lot of options about constraining scope that each directive will get. But the main point is it's reusable. It's fairly, you know, quite easily testable, and it's very expressive in the markup. You can see exactly what's going on, and that's what I think is one of the main benefits of this kind of approach. You don't have to reverse engineer and have a look through your JavaScript and see which CSS selectors are being hit, or there's custom attributes. You know, what does that get hooked up in the code? It's very expressive. Caveats though, this custom element, IE doesn't like that, doesn't like custom elements. However, Angular does provide a shim that you can load in. So for any custom elements, it actually creates it in IE's DOM first, and once it's created in IE, it will then recognize it from that point on. So if you happen to want to use this approach, you need to include the AngularJS shim for IE, and that'll fix all that up for you. However, my personal opinion is I prefer the attribute approach, but it's entirely up to you. All this code, by the way, is downloadable from the links at the end, so you don't have to worry too much about remembering all this. You'll get this whole solution, demo pages, as well as this presentation is all written in AngularJS and MVC with a few web API components in there as well. So feel free to download and have a look at it. Okay, we're almost at the end. Again, it's fairly sort of broad flyby, but it's kind of necessary to hit all these things because it will give you a good perspective of what AngularJS does, particularly in relation to Knockout.js. So it supports forms and validation. It works. It's a little bit odd how it does it, but it does work. So if we just go quickly to the demo page, you can see enter full name there. I've got this nice little graphic showing me that's invalid. If I start putting a name in, you can see the background changes. If I enter a phone number in the correct format, you see background changes, that little thing disappears, we get the save button, and the border changes from red to green. Taking that away, I can click on that. It says enter phone number, it's all good. But what you'll notice down here is as I'm typing, these things will change. So if I go up here and I take that out, and you look at scope, my form invalid, or the value of that, invalid is true, sorry, so the whole form's still invalid. Put that in. Okay, you can say that changed to false, and that changed to true. So what it's doing is on your scope, this form is called my form. And if I have a look at form validation, down here. Form name my form. It's got all these dollar values which it sets dynamically for you, and then you can just, using those values, you can conditionally apply a class or do any manner of things based off these values on the scope. So scope my form $invalid, $valid, my form name, which is the name of this input element. Currently valid is true. If I take that out, you can see valid is false. The whole form validity is false, and yes, of course, it's invalid. The converse of that is that it's invalid. So you can, again, you can conditionally apply classes based on the values of all these values on the scope that Angular populates automatically for you. It's just a bit odd. The syntax is a bit odd. So you need to know, the actual name of your form in your controller, which kind of binds it to the view a little, and you've got all these $invalid, $valid values to work with. So it works, but it's a little bit odd. I believe they're currently looking at better ways to do that, but for now, that's pretty much about it. But having said that, it is quite easy. So our form is I've got. Actually, I should put no validate. So what I'm doing here is I've got a form with no validate on it. This no validate is telling HTML5 not to validate it. Reason being that Angular, it can interfere with the custom validation that Angular provides. So the HTML5 aspect of it will bring up these little pop-ups, depending on the browser, saying this field is invalid, and that Angular doesn't know about that. So it's best to turn off validation within a form if you're using AngularJS validation. In fact, probably for most validation. So what we've got on that form is saying, when that form is submitted, I want you to execute that function on the scope. We're using form controller. Our input is required. It's bound to this model, persondetails.name. We've got a placeholder there. Age is also required. We're binding to that model. For the phone, a little bit more complex. Instead of saying required, which is traditional HTML5 stuff, we've got data ng required. It's only required if the age is greater than or equal to 14. I've got a validation error mark custom directive, which is what you see. Oh, go away. What you see here. And all I'm saying here is for the mark is validation error phone. It's actually a CSS style to apply to, which will show that validation error mark. And the message is please enter phone number, which is what you see when you click on it there. Okay, the model is phone. The NG pattern is just pretty much 8 digits, which is why if I just do, like say 7 digits, that's still invalid, 8 is fine. And I've got a placeholder. So, you know, it's just, again, very declarative against each element. That's saying it's required, that's required. And here I'm just data binding to these particular items on the scope. So on this input type at the bottom, ng show is myForm $valid, so that'll only show the save button if the whole form is valid. Okay, we're not doing anything too spectacular there. In terms of the controller, form controller, you know, it's very, very simple. Setting up person details with an age at 18. That save form function, if the form is invalid, then just say it's invalid and return, but because we're not showing the save button, you know, you're probably never going to hit that. But if it's okay, then we say data can be saved. Nothing spectacular in the controller. It's all really about declaratively identifying what needs to be done in the view. So again, pretty obvious what's going on, all in line with Angular's way of being very explicit about things, showing exactly what's happening. Now that validation error mark directive, I'm not going to go into detail with that. I'll let you investigate that as part of your homework. But it's a more complex version of a directive because it does some fairly particular DOM manipulation. But it's downloadable and you feel free to use it. Okay, you with me on that one? So forms validation, pretty easy. Again, it's the same as just checking values on the scope. Just that Angular populates based on what is invalid, what is valid, depending on how you've told those elements to be validated. Okay. Internationalization and localization. Angular supports the internationalization and localization for date times, numbers only at the moment, like currencies, numbers, whatever. So any localization of text needs to be kind of done by yourself. But it does have libraries you can include that make that easy for a number format. And in addition, it also supports pluralization based on certain forms of pluralization, because that can get quite tricky across different languages. So it's not too prescriptive that way. It lets you do what you want and provides the basic support for that, because that's actually quite a hard task. So just looking at the demo, actually I'll show you the markup for this one first. Where are you, internationalization? There we are. Okay, so I've got this internationalization controller. And for the date, I'm just showing the current date time as displaying it as full date, an amount as currency, an amount as a number, and I'm showing what the current locale ID is. Don't worry about this section down here for now. So if we look at the demo page, you know, we've got that. This all looks pretty normal. The current locate in US. So that all looks good. Now, we've got these other locales that we can include. So let's say we're going to do Arabic. So I'm just including that script. And this is all provided by Angular. You can go to the Angular site and download one or more of these scripts. However, you would typically have to conditionally include these through server logic or some other logic that would tell it what to include on the page, what scripts to include on the page. So it's up to you what to include. Angular doesn't make any decisions about that. So if I reload that page, you know, you can see it's all changing. So that's as far as localization, globalization, include the right script, dates, numbers, currencies, they'll all get formatted correctly for you automatically, which is pretty handy. But you have to determine what locale scripts to include. The other aspect to this is currently pluralization. So, you know, what kind of, how to pluralize certain words or phrases, again, becomes quite hard. So let's have a look at what we're doing here. So down here, actually we'll go into the controller first, which will explain what we're doing. Internationalization controller. So all I've got is attendees, which is an array, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2000, blah, 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 a few numbers. So based on a number, we're going to attempt to pluralize a phrase. So back, sorry for the flicking around. So with this unordered list, I'm saying, all right, use the ng repeat directive for each item in the attendees array. We're going to assign it to attendee count. So in the li, we're going to say, I want you to pluralize attendee count. So the count is whatever that value is. So if it's going through the array, it's going to be 0, 1, 2, whatever's in that array. When attendee forms, and what that is doing is it's saying, all right, using these forms of pluralization. Okay, so this is the attendee forms of pluralization. When we see 0, we're going to substitute no one came. When we see 1, it's going to be that number attendee. When we see 2, it's a pair of attendees. When we see 3, it's a trio of attendees, and also displaying the number. But this is only for EN-US locale. So going back to here, if I put EN-US back in, refresh the page, you can see I've got no one came, 1 attendee, pair of attendees, trio of attendees. So it's just going through that array, saying based on a number, my pluralization or plural phrase is, this for 2, and this for 3, and this for 2000. So it's just a kind of a way of you allowing the flexibility to do what you want. I haven't really used this feature of it yet, but it is there if you want to get really fine-tuned in your localization and internationalization. You guys with me on that one? Okay. Okay, minification. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with this concept yet, I'm not sure, but it's just a way of getting your JavaScript and removing all the white space and comments and minifying it and sticking it up to your server. You need to code Angular with that in mind. And it's fairly easy to do. You saw a hint of that earlier on. So looking at a minification controller, for example. So this controller, this unsafe controller, it'll work in debug mode fine while you're developing, but when it goes to minify, Angular looks for these names to do dependency injection. And when it gets minified, it'll be something like A, B, C, and then that'll be replaced throughout the course of your JS code just to minify everything down. Obviously, when Angular has a look at that, it doesn't know what A, B, or C is, so it can't inject anything in there. So the way to get around that is you can still have exactly that same function declaration, telling it it's a minify safe control in this instance, but prior to the function, you just have this array. It says, all right, this is the actual string literal of what I'm injecting. Because it's a string literal, that won't get shortened down to anything because you can't do that as far as minification is concerned. That'll change the value of the literal. And because that's the first one, that gets injected into that one. So even though that gets transformed to A when it gets minified, Angular says, all right, but I've still got that in my minification list as number 1, so I'll stick that there. Make sense? Bottom line of that is just make sure you include this syntax everywhere you go. If you find that in debug mode it's working fine, then you go to release and you minify everything, and everything just blows up, that's probably a good reason why. Very easy to do, but just got to bear that in mind. Okay, so we're going into, we've kind of covered all the main aspects of it. There's a few more basic topics, not basic topics, but kind of the surface area of Angular, which we'll touch on a bit later on. But now we're getting to more of the structuring an app and sort of tips and tricks and those kinds of things. So it's important to start with a good folder structure because you can separate everything out. You might end up having lots of controllers and lots of directives and lots of services and lots of factories. So get a good folder structure first up. There's predominantly 2 ways. And this one is how we're using it within Saasu at the moment. So we'll have our app framework. We're separating our application declarations into a folder. We've got controllers folder, which has whatever single page application, and currently there's a taxable payments report page in Saasu. So that's this directory hosts all our taxable payment report controllers. And for any other pages in the app that use Angular, we'll create separate controller directories for that. You can structure it differently, so you can just have one directory with your single page app name, which might be taxable payment report, and then you'll have the controllers and directives folders underneath that. Either way is a good approach. Just get it done sort of early rather than later. That way you don't have to go back and refactor all your code to make that happen. And it will certainly be nice, particularly as you get deeper and deeper and create more and more. You say, oh, geez, I've got to edit such and such control. You know exactly where in the directory structure to go. If you're using jQuery validation or unobtrusive validation, or it's just in there, kind of get rid of it. It'll cause conflicts, or it can cause conflicts. Sort of make a call either way. You can still use it. Don't get me wrong, but use one or the other. Don't sort of mix and match. You don't have to use jQuery. But I tend to keep it because we utilize some of the animation functions from it, and particularly in directives, it's very familiar territory, works well. I like it. Also load Angular early, so a lot of the time best practice will say load all your JS down the bottom of the page, load Angular at the top, so we can be involved in the page processing as early as possible, and you won't get any page flicker, or you'll minimize any data binding artifacts. Okay. Other things, conditionals in common view to enable Angular. What we did in Saasu, we've since changed it because we're doing different things, but a good way is if you've got multiple pages in the app, you may not want to use Angular on all of them, is you can have a conditional that will tell it whether to invoke Angular or not. And if we look at this actual presentation, so the layout, yep. So in the layout, I'm saying, all right, if there's Angular app name defined on the view bag, then Angular is enabled, and we assign the Angular app name to that as well. That way down here, we can say, all right, if Angular is enabled, let's include the script for it. And earlier in some of the other pages here, at the top, we just say view bag Angular app name equals demo app, and so that causes Angular to be loaded. That app name gets defined in the view down on here somewhere around here. There we are. Data ng app gets defined there. So it's just a way of dynamically invoking Angular in your app. If you're always going to use it in every page, I wouldn't bother doing it. It's just extra complexity. But with Saasu, we've got a stack of pages which have evolved over time. So now that we're introducing Angular, we don't want that automatically invoked on every single page. So we conditionally invoked it. Test in release mode. So make sure you set when you're developing, set it to release mode and run it. This is to just to verify that you will work when things are minified, provided you have minification enabled on your release configuration. VS 2013 and ReSharper has AngularJS IntelliSense extensions. So if I go div ng dash click, you can see that I've got some IntelliSense going on there. It's probably a bit small, but it's there. So 2013 has that. ReSharper. ReSharper also has that. Sidewaffle.com. It gives you templates. This is community created, but it gives you templates for creating a controller and a directive. Really good for people just starting up in Angular, because you get that in your Visual Studio. Add new file, select AngularJS controller, and it gives you boilerplate code to use. So it's quite cool, quite handy. I've talked about this already, but a brief comparison of AngularJS and Knockout.js. Knockout.js is mostly imperative, so it's very programmatic via these things called observables. Have you guys had a chance to look at Knockout.js yet? Or had to play with it at all? No? Okay, so when you do get to, if you deciding what to use and you have a look at it, I'll show you a brief example here. It's very programmatic and uses this concept of observable, so it needs to change the JavaScript object slightly. Whereas AngularJS just uses plain JSON objects and it is declarative. That's one of its main premises. Knockout.js is all about data binding. It's very good at it, so if you choose that, you're not making a wrong decision, but it's just about data binding. It's very good at it, it's very fast, but it's just that. AngularJS, I'm hoping, as you've seen here, covers a much, much broader range of topics. So one library covers a whole range of things, whereas, as opposed to picking Knockout.js for one and something else for another. And if you've got other frameworks, things like Durandal is a good one. It uses Knockout.js for binding, and it uses a whole bunch of other libraries as well to pull in all the functionality that it needs. But I feel that comes at a cost because when you pull in all these multiple libraries, you've got all these numerous dependencies. 3 of those libraries get updated, and suddenly you've got a really hairy test situation on your hands. In the last, there was the link is down here. In the last performance comparison, AngularJS was a little faster. The difference is not noticeable though. So while there's a technical difference, I wouldn't be too phased unless you've got sort of masses of data binding going on, at which point you probably want to rethink what you're doing on your page. This demo page, is nothing spectacular. What's more important is the way it's done. So where am I? Here we are. So knockout binding. This is very simple, but we've got KO data. First name is where we're creating an observable based off these values. So by observable, it means that it'll pretty much fire an event each time anything is changed with those properties, and it's probably why Knockout.js is a little bit slower. Because if you can imagine, say, an array of properties and multiple items are changed, events are being fired each time a change occurs. Difference with Angular is it'll take a snapshot of something at the start of manipulation, let all this stuff happen, and at the very end, do a comparison and see what's changed and then fire what's appropriate. So there's the differences there. And it's why things like directives need to happen at a certain point in the life cycle, because Angular just lets all this happen and then does a change check at the bottom. If you're doing DOM manipulation in the controller, which is a certain point in the life cycle, this sequential series of steps where Angular is comparing things gets out of whack, and the data binding may be affected. So at any rate, this is the Knockout.js version of it. And this is the Angular version of it, where we're just throwing stuff on the scope, and then whacking into the view. If you have a look at the markup for each, they're not particularly different. You've seen the Angular one with the moustache syntax, and similarly with the Knockout one, you've got data-bind text first name, data-bind text age, those kinds of things. So both are pretty easy to read. It's up to you which one you want to use. But again, I feel AngularJS offers a bit more advantage because you get the plain old JSON objects to use, and the data binding works very well. It's very explicit, and the range of other features that you get with it too. Testing. Because everything's dependency injected in your controllers and directives and everywhere, you can include those in tests. You can inject whatever you want. Mock-up versions of a directive that doesn't actually call to the server. You can just provide some dummy data for it, so your controllers and everything becomes quite testable. There's plenty of samples of that around on the web. Jasmine and this Karma are fairly popular choices. However, we're using QUnit on Saasu, and that works quite well. Just try and integrate it early, because if you're trying to integrate it too late, it can be quite complex. General tips and tricks: keep controllers lean like you would in the MVC world. Don't make them too thick and have just big spaghetti code blobs of functionality. Keep the controllers lean. If you find they're getting too large, you might want to split that out into services, factories, whatever makes sense. Don't be tempted to change DOM in controllers. I've spoken about that already, but I encourage you to play with it and see what happens. See if it blows up. There's a thing called Angular UI, which is just like jQuery UI. It provides the same set of functionality. And I'll show you that in a second. And I've said here, don't bother Angular animation until AngularJS 1.2. When I first did this slide, 1.2 wasn't out yet. And in previous versions, the animation was still in a state of flux. However, you can do animation in AngularJS now. It's 1.2 has been released. But it's a bit more complex. It involves defining pseudo elements in CSS and applying certain transforms and things like that. But it's certainly possible. Alternatively, you could have a directive that does some jQuery animation. It's up to you. Here's some Angular examples here. So Angular UI, you've got a tooltip. You can see I've got the tooltip going on. I can open a modal. And I'll show you the markup for this in a second. It's pretty easy. We've got a star control, and this is just a few of the examples. There's a lot more to it, and we've got a image carousel down here as well. So you can just flick through the slides. That's all cool. Just looking quickly at the markup for that, which will explain why it's it's pretty cool. So the tooltip, it's all directive driven. So here's the tooltip trigger, tooltip placement. Okay, haven't had to do much apart from include Angular UI and define that declaratively in the markup. Same with the dialog. I've got the dialog defined here, and I've got an open modal function on the scope. Star rating control. Again, I won't go into the details, but it's just all directive driven. Properties on that element is all that it's doing. And the control takes care of the rest. With the carousel, it's allowing us to create an element. I've got a carousel here with a slide. So for each slide in slides that I've defined in my controller, I've just got an array in the controller. Set up this image, and that's pretty much about it. It takes care of doing all the, putting the, scrolling the images left to right periodically, clicking it over to the right, those kinds of things. So very small amount of markup. And in terms of the controller, there's not that much there. There's my list of images there. I'm just defining data on the scope. That's all there is. And you guys have already seen that, just with general data binding. It's really easy. Moving along. Oh yeah, debugging. It's important. If you use the debugger statement, it'll work sometimes. Well, it'll always stop in the debugger, but it can play havoc with Angular's data binding. So if you call a debugger statement in JavaScript code, it breaks into debugging. You start having a look at things, and you hit play and expect everything to resume normally. Sometimes it doesn't. So don't just be aware of that. It is very good at throwing exceptions in the console. So if something breaks or it's not working, or something's not data binding, go to the console. For example, in Chrome here, if you go to the console here, you'll see all these exceptions pop up. These are actually different. These are related to live view. But you'll see fairly explicit exceptions about what Angular is complaining about. Batarang is a good Chrome add-in. You can see I've got a little AngularJS option right there. If I click on that, and get rid of that stupid thing. I've got it enabled on this page. You can see it's telling me what I've got in the scope, and you can see there's various nested scopes here. So it's good for examining what's going on. If I go to dependencies, you can see it's showing me what dependencies I've got there, which is pretty cool. In addition, performance, it's telling you what's taking the most amount of time on your page with respect to Angular. It's really cool, really handy. I'm tossing up whether to show you this bit here, but I will anyway. So you can also, let's say I want to do test out changing something on this page. I'm going to select this element here. Go to the console, and I'll say, what was the thing? So what I'm going to do in debugger, I'll say, give me that. So I've got Angular element $0 scope. This is after clicking on an item. You can see it's giving me that object there. So I'm going to drill down into that object. I'm going to go to the parent. And I'll go to the parent again. And I've got this slide probably hard to see. That slide object there. So I'm going to go into a slide. This is probably more advanced, but let's say I'm going to change that to SSW rocks. How's that for a plug for you, Adam? And I've changed that, but you notice it didn't change up here. What I also have to do, because I'm outside of Angular's lifetime, or its life cycle, I should say, is I have to execute the $apply on the scope and say, all right, well, there's been changes. I've manually done changes. I want you to apply them. And you'll see that it applies that to the page for us. It's kind of kicking in this data check that Angular does at the end of its life cycle so that it does the data binding. This is our manual way of doing it. But anyway, that's sort of more advanced. We're getting into debugging of it. And that's about it. As I mentioned, all this is on the presentation that's up on Azure, which I'll go back to the start if you want the, oh no, there's the URL. Download it from there, or download Angular from there. The full source code is there. Go up, grab it, change it, play with it, do whatever you want. That includes this whole deck and all the demos and everything. You can log on to it there. There's the Angular UI address. And that's the URL for the resharper support. So with that, are there any questions? Anybody have any questions around Angular? Yes?
Okay. Okay, that's loud. You said that the voids DOM manipulation and it still refreshes page data. I was just wondering how it goes about doing that.
The internals of it?
Yeah.
That's a good question. As I mentioned, it has a certain life cycle about doing things, so it'll kind of take a snapshot of the DOM as far as it's concerned. So when you've got controllers defined, it has a look at, at those definitions, take a snapshot of it, then go through all this life cycle of events, which will be DOM manipulation, applying watches, and then rereading those sections of the DOM again to see what's changed. So as to the actual technicals of how it does it, I'm not 100% sure, but I know that it just does a snapshot check, start and end, and that's it. Does that answer your question? Yeah, it is to exactly how it manipulates DOM. It just uses some very, very cluey ways of doing it, and as performant as possible, because these guys at Google that do it, they're obviously very, very skilled, and the techniques that they do are sort of rocket science. Very black magic voodoo stuff. Sorry, I can't be more direct with the answer there because I haven't gone into detail about how it actually changes the DOM. Anybody else? No? Want one more?
Yeah, one more while I'm at it. You said that you can apply filters and formatters. I'm just wondering, can you use the pipe to apply multiple versions?
I believe you can. I haven't done it myself, but I believe you can apply multiple filters. I'm not sure the exact syntax of that though. You can create your own filters as well. So if you wanted something custom, you could use an existing filter, which we've done to say get a date, and then sort of apply more functionality to it. So you can either create your own custom ones, inherit from the existing ones, and I believe you can apply multiple ones. But I'm not sure the syntax of that.
And one more question while
Sure.
I'm at it. You said that you can use IntelliSense in Visual Studio. Is that just downloaded via the NuGet?
Yes, I believe the latest Visual Studio with all the updates should have it. But you may, I can't honestly remember whether you have to get it from NuGet or not. I didn't think so. But I'm guessing you're having a look at your Visual Studio and you don't see it?
Oh, I haven't used it in Visual Studio yet, so I
Oh,
was just
okay.
asking.
Yeah, I believe if it's in there, if you've got all the updates for Visual Studio, it should just be in there. I don't think you have to do a NuGet package for it, but I'll confirm that for you if you like.
Awesome.
Thanks, Paul. Adam Stevenson here. For the students here and at home, can we walk through a simple binding example from File New MVC project?
Yeah, we could do that.
I'd like a simple page with fields for name and age. As I type my name and age, I want a message shown underneath that says, hello name, you are X years old.
Okay.
If either field is empty, can we show a message saying you need to enter first name and age? And if the text in age is not a valid number, can I see a number telling me to enter in a valid integer?
Oh, God. Okay. All right, you're going to have to bear with me then. So I'll just do it within the app here. We'll go new item, HTML page, and we'll call it SSW. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to borrow some includes. Okay, so all I'm doing at the top there is including AngularJS. And I'll say app equals SSW. How's that? And all right, so what I'll probably just do all the script in page is probably better. Okay. So I get my module, define that. Oh, sorry. So that matches that. Then I'm going to say div, I'll do it properly, section, and label. Actually, ng model equals name. Label, oh, label age, ng model equals age. Okay. I shall get a controller from somewhere. Sorry, keyboard's not so hot. All right, let's see if this works. I'll go away. Oh, sorry, hang on one sec. The JS got loaded. Controller, basic controller, yep. Controller, sorry, my SSW. Section. NG controller equals basic controller. Yep. Oh, come on. No module SSW. This is NG app equals SSW. Okay, so it's at least being verbose. It's telling me no module SSW. I don't know why it's telling me that though. What do we got here? So, well, at least you're seeing the, you know, the errors in action. No module defined, basic controls undefined. I will say, though, one of the things that I didn't mention is, and it's probably prevalent here, I don't know why this is not working, but it is a steep learning curve, or much steeper than Knockout.js. And some of the documentation is mostly good, but can be leave a little to be desired. And it's, you know, the guys that create this are kind of rocket scientist material, so you'll come across terms like transclusion and things like that, and you just think, whatever, give me a simple example to follow. And there's plenty out there now. If you go into Google+, there's a good community forum around that, which helps immensely. And they've just had NG-Conf over in the US somewhere, which is a whole bunch of videos that have been streamed that you can have a look at and watch how to create directives, the benefit of promises, and all these kinds of things, which is really valuable as well.
If I was understanding correctly, by using this, I don't have to use Knockout or jQuery. It actually covers all of those and more by the sounds of it.
Correct, yes.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, sorry. He was saying his understanding is if by using this you don't need to use Knockout.js or jQuery, and the answer to that was correct. Yeah, it covers a whole lot.
But you still recommend using jQuery?
Well, I like jQuery because in my directives I'll do some animation and things like that, and it offers more advanced element selection and query syntax. So yeah, I include jQuery. So the question was, is that still true of 1.2? And that's correct, yes. All right, let me try and figure out why this isn't working. Ah, that probably makes sense. Yeah, got an element out. Oh Christ, now what? Media system, media system. So just to reassert that it can actually work is you know, it's binding and everything now. So we've got the start of it. It was merely a case of fat fingers, and I'd left out a head element, and then I'd had some crappy markup in there. which caused the document to be invalid. So, it's all working now. This is the data binding aspect of it. What I've done is I've got Angular. I use the same bootstrap that I've got, so to create my Angular module. And I've got Angular Basics SSW controller that I'm including. So all I'm doing is basic controller. I'm bringing the scope in, and I'm setting name and age just to some values. You don't have to do it that way. I could create an object and bind to that. And in the markup, I've got my app as Angular demo, controller's basic controller. I've got ng models on the 2 inputs, and down in the label, I'm saying hello name, you are whatever years old. So that's doing the data binding. The next aspect is the forms validation. But I won't do that now unless you want me to, and I'll kind of let you work through that, or do you want me to go that far?
If you can do it now,
Yeah, just do it so you can finish it.
Oh, you're a cheater. I'm fair dinkum. Okay. All right, let's put some validation in. So you need to enter first name and age.
Let's get them to do this.
Oh, okay, all right. Yeah, if you want them, they can go ahead and do this, and then you can show them just the advanced bit.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I can wait till they've done that bit and then do that bit with them if they want.
Good idea.
Okay.
I've been running SSW for 20 years. I've also been a lecturer at the University of Technology, Sydney for many years, and I think the gap is getting wider between what they're being taught and what employers need for the guys to hit the ground running and be able to do real work.
Looking for a job as a junior developer can be really tough. There are so many applicants out there, and it's really hard for an employer to separate one from the other. They try really hard, but it's a challenge for them.
One of the problems when you come out of university is everything you learn at university isn't directly transferable into the enterprise.
I think I've seen all the problems that companies are having with new recruits. That's why we created Bootcamp.
The bootcamp is a place where you'll go for 9 weeks, 40 to 60 hours a week, and do one thing and one thing only. That is learn to code in Microsoft technologies.
You're going to be learning MVC 5, HTML5. These technologies are really important because the uptake in the industry is huge. So this course will just fill that gap between university and starting work.
At the bootcamp, you have a mentor, and that mentor gets you over a challenge you may have straight away, so you can go on to the next challenge. Instead of sitting there for hours searching Google and trying to find answers that sometimes you just can't find.
It's important to have a mentor because it stops you going off track. It stops you getting stuck on things that aren't really important. It happens time and time again where people are going through things that they found on the internet.
What they really need is experience and hands-on coding. And this bootcamp is going to give people the hands-on experience in coding for 9 weeks. Because if you can do as opposed to learn, you have your best chance at getting job ready for your first job in the industry.
It's not an easy course. For 9 weeks, you're thrown into the fire. You live and breathe .NET code. You live and breathe learning best practices and working as part of the team. You'll be working a minimum of 40 hours and mostly 60 hours a week, every week.
Becoming job ready is more than just learning how to write code. You need to know how to work in a team, you need to know how to gather requirements, you need to know how to use the tool set, the Microsoft stack of tools. And during the bootcamp, we're going to be teaching you all these other aspects, the soft skills of development that, by yourself, learning from a book, learning through Google or videos, you just will never learn.
It's not just coding skills, it's also communication skills and the ability to work as part of a small team.
The whole course is run using Scrum, so you'll learn Scrum inside out. At SSW, we've been using Scrum since literally day one, so you'll learn from all our experiences, and you'll just be able to join the company at the end of the course, and you'll be able to fit straight in their team, so you'll be a big asset to any company that you join.
One of the most exciting parts for the students is the gala at the end of the 9 weeks.
The gala is where you showcase what you've done to a room of prospective employers. This is where the rubber meets the road.
At this gala, you're going to be able to present the work that you've created and what you've learned, not to your mum and dad, but to real employers, people looking for junior developers. And at that gala, you're going to be able to present and then talk and discuss with them. And we're going to help you try and get a job at the end, because we believe that the graduates of the bootcamp are the best graduates on the market.
And that is a damn lot better than sending your resume to recruiters who you can only hope will put your best foot forward.
By spending 9 weeks intensely in the bootcamp, learning nothing and doing nothing but .NET programming, and then creating a real app that you can show your prospective employer is impressive. It's impressive because it shows you're passionate, and it shows that you've gone through an incredibly difficult course that most people would never go through. And that's the type of person that we look for at SSW.